submarine that turned into a ticking time bomb. The K-19 was the first nuclear-powered submarine invented by the Soviet Union. Construction started on October 17, 1958, on what would later become known as the 658 class submarine. The vessel was 374 feet long, with a stretching beam 30 feet. It was armed with R-13 submarine-launched ballistic missiles, SLBM. The R-13 was a single-stage liquid fuel rocket and was 38.9 feet long. It first launched in 1961. The missile was the first Soviet design to use a small set of rocket engines to adjust course and trajectory instead of aerodynamic control surfaces. But 4 stabilizers were used to keep the missile on track during early flight. The end result was a missile with a range of 370 miles and the ability to deliver intense nuclear explosions. It only took 2 years for the K-19 to be finished, with many seeing her as a rushed job. So why were the Soviets so keen on completing the submarine quickly? Although they were further ahead of the United States at this point in the space race, with the successful launch of Sputnik 1, the late 50s and early 60s were in the full swing of the Cold War, with both countries trying to show that they were superior. The USS Nautilus was launched in 1958 by the United States. Because it was nuclear-powered and didn't need fuel refills like diesel engine vessels, the Nautilus set multiple records, including the first submersible to reach the geographic North Pole, as well as the first submerged journey around the Arctic. Of course, this wasn't something the Soviets let slide, and so they felt obliged to create their own nuclear submarine, quickly. The construction of the K-19 prioritized having a nuclear sub in the water as soon as possible. This meant that often corners were cut, and the work was so rushed that there were countless accidents during her creation, leading to the deaths of 10 workers. A fire killed 2 workmen. Then 6 women who were gluing rubber liners to a water cistern died from inhaling the fumes. An electrician was killed when he was crushed by a missile tube cover, while fellow workers were loading missiles at the same time, and an engineer died after slipping. One accident, which seemed quite innocent compared to those, involved a small piece of solder dripping down onto one of the coolant pipes for the submarine's nuclear reactor, creating a crack in the metal that went unnoticed by engineers. It would be this small mistake that spelled the K-19's demise. But that wouldn't be for some time, since first the K-19 needed to be launched and celebrated. For that, she would need a captain. That honor went to Nikolai Vladimirovich Zatayev. Formerly a navigation officer, Zatayev had shown promise and had even been noted by Russian war hero Georgy Zhukov. As a result, he was promoted to the rank of captain and was in command of the very first nuclear submarine for his country. Despite this, finding a crew proved difficult. Many Soviet naval officers doubted the combat readiness of the sub, especially with how quickly it was built. To combat this, sailors who chose to work aboard the nuclear submarine fleet were tempted by superior rations, including smoked fish, cheeses, sausages, and even gourmet chocolate. This food was a cut way above what other crews received at the time, causing many to enlist despite the dangers. Then, before she engaged in active service, K-19 would undertake various testing procedures. On July 12, 1960, she made her first test voyage and spent 4 days at sea. She was then brought back for further adjustments before heading out again on a longer test trip, this time between August 12 and November 8, 1960, during which she traveled 10,779 miles. These test runs weren't without their trials and tribulations. The crew noticed that a lot of the hull's rubber coating had detached after coming out of a full-power run, and the entire surface of the boat needed to be recoated. After a test dive to her maximum depth of 980 feet, the reactor department started flooding. Worried about what may happen, the order was sent out for the sub to immediately resurface. Since the vessel hadn't been able to get rid of the excess water, once she reached the surface of the ocean, the extra weight caused her to turn over onto her port side. Investigations were then made to find out what had caused the problem. As with many things that went wrong on board K-19, this too boiled down to the rushed nature of her construction. While she was being built, engineers failed to replace a broken gasket, which allowed water to flow in. In October 1960, the ninth compartment was flooded. This time it wasn't a faulty gasket, but instead the work of the galley crew who'd fed wood from the equipment crates into the waste system, clogging it and causing the flood. Just 4 days after her return, K-19 was declared finished on November 12, 1960. That wasn't the end of her problems though, since just 1 month later in December of that year, a coolant leak caused a circuit pump failure. Thankfully, experts from the shipbuilding yard at Severodvinsk, where K-19 was originally laid down during her construction, were able to travel out to the submarine and fix the issue while she was at sea. The process took about a week. Before we continue, make sure you leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you've enjoyed the video so far. Now, back to the action. Finally, the submarine was officially launched on June 4, 1961. As if it was heralding the bad luck that would plague K-19, when it came time to christen her, not only did the honor go to a man, traditionally it's performed by a woman, the bottle of champagne used to strike her hull bounced off the rubber lining instead of shattering. She had a crew of 139 men, as well as observed officers who were not part of the crew but were there to oversee and give feedback on the submarine's progress to Russian officials who were invested in the project. Things were not exactly simple sailing once she set out to sea. But then again, given everything that happened before she was finally commissioned, you probably knew this was coming. On July 4, 1961, K-19 was patrolling the waters of the North Atlantic Ocean on a training mission when disaster suddenly struck. During routine maneuvers, the flow of coolant to the reactor stopped altogether. Normally, nuclear reactors have a backup system to make sure that if one coolant system fails, another one can be fired up to take over and avoid a nuclear meltdown. But the K-19, most likely due to the hurried circumstances under which she was built, didn't have one of these safeguards. Captain Zatayev, in his very first command post as captain of a ship, was faced with something that none of his fellow crew had ever experienced. Not only that, but there was the fear that if the reactor did actually explode, thanks to the tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States, NATO and the United States may see it as an attempted nuclear strike. This could then lead to a preemptive attack on the Soviet Union in retaliation, and as a result, start World War III. Unsurprisingly, the situation threatened to overwhelm Zatayev, and he even commented in later interviews about the submarine that there had been a temptation at that moment to rush down to his cabin and hold a pistol to his head, instead of dealing with the weight of so many men's lives on his shoulders. But Zatayev managed to pull himself together and face the dire reality of the situation. He asked for volunteers from the engineering crew who would be willing to fix the issue. Although this may sound like a simple task, Zatayev knew the gravity of what he was asking these volunteers to do. K-19 did not have any protective material and clothing on board, and the best they could find was raincoats and gas masks. Anyone who chose to go to the reactor and saw the cooling system would likely die from radiation. 22 men volunteered despite the dangers. Headed down into the submarine, they managed to rig together an improvised coolant system and carefully install it by hand. K-19 and her crew had been saved, but for the 22 volunteers, their fates were sealed. Despite the fact that they tried to take as many preventative measures as possible, including working in groups of 3 for only 5 to 10 minutes at a time in the irradiated space, it wasn't enough. Zatayev remembers walking one of the first volunteers down to the reactor room and asking the man Boris Korchilov if he knew exactly what he signed up for. Boris turned to him and said, "I know, Comrade Captain." 5 minutes later, Boris stumbled out of the reactor room, took off his mask and immediately vomited. Even for that short amount of time, he and the other 21 other men had taken far more than a lethal radiation dose. The effects of the radiation on their bodies showed almost immediately. Exposed skin turned red and their hands and feet swelled up. Blood vessels rose to the surface and their hairline bled. Just 2 hours after their exposure, A lot of the men were completely unrecognizable to their fellow crewmates. The volunteers died in excruciating pain, unable to move as the radiation ate away at their bodies. Some of them, although only able to manage just the faintest of whispers, asked to be put out of their misery. Within the next week or so, 8 of them were dead. Within the next 2 years, the rest followed. All 22 men, although managing to avoid a disaster that could have been on a global scale, lost their lives thanks to the reactor room of K-19. The question was what K-19 could do next. The long-range radio system had already broken, so they weren't able to contact anyone in Moscow to send out help. There was also the issue of a very frightened crew after narrowly avoiding a nuclear meltdown, so much so that a mutiny was feared. Zatayev had all small arms on the submarine thrown overboard to avoid this temptation. The submarine then sent out a low distress signal and headed towards where it knew other diesel-powered submarines were located. A few US vessels also picked up the signal, but Zatayev ignored them. Even in their time of need, he could not give up state secrets once they realized the K-19 wasn't simply a regular Russian sub. Thankfully, S-270 picked up the distress transmission and went out to help. The crew was evacuated onto S-270, and K-19 was towed back to base. There, the submarine didn't stop her wave of destruction. Once docked, K-19 radioactively contaminated over 2,300 feet around her, as well as the engineers that worked to repair her over a period of 2 years. Even more disturbingly, the entire radioactive compartment was stripped bare from the submarine and dumped into the Kara Sea. An investigation also took place, looking for the cause of the incident. With this, it was finally revealed that the tiny crack in the coolant pipe during her construction had been the main reason behind the radioactive disaster. A welder had forgotten to place the asbestos drop cloths onto the pips in order to protect them from welding sparks, and a spark hit one of the coolant pipes, causing an invisible crack. Over time and pressure, the crack eventually formed and opened wider, resulting in the coolant system failure. Once she was fully repaired, K-19 re-entered service, but this time with a new unofficial name. Thanks to the death toll she accrued through radiation, including some of those who were repairing her, as well as some crew members who were not part of the 22 volunteers, many started to call her Hiroshima. Although the next few years of her service would be uneventful, in 1969, K-19 was yet again involved in an incident. K-19 collided with the attack submarine USS Gato in the Barents Sea on November 15th. The collision severely wrecked the sonar equipment at her bow and distorted the front torpedo tube covers. Thankfully, she resurfaced and was repaired at port with no lives lost. As for the USS Gato, it was pretty much unscathed by the collision and carried on. A fire broke out on February 24, 1972, while the submarine was about 390 feet underwater, nearly 800 miles off the Canadian coast. The crew of K-12 was evacuated once the ship surfaced. 12 men, though, remained on board, trapped in the aft torpedo room with no light or heat. A strong wind delayed towing, and rescuers were unable to access the torpedo room thanks to the inaccessible engine room. On April 4th, K-19 was towed to Severomorsk, and the sailors were finally rescued after enduring 24 days in the lightless, heatless chamber. Almost 30 ships participated in the rescue effort, which lasted more than 40 days. Although the men in the torpedo chamber lived, 30 sailors were killed in the fire, which was caused by a hydraulic fluid spill, according to investigators. K-19 went on to cost the life of another sailor in 1982, when 2 crew members were seriously burned by an electrical short circuit. V.A. Kravchuk, one of the men, died from his injuries 5 days after the incident. K-19 continued to serve her country until she was finally decommissioned on April 19, 1990. She was taken to the Nerpa shipyard in 2002 to be scrapped. Over her 29 years of service, she was operational for 20,223 hours and traveled over 332,300 396 miles. The legacy of K-19 lives on in her crew members. Those on board during the major nuclear incident in 1961, including Captain Zatayev, were nominated by ex-Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2006 for their bravery. Thanks for watching. We hope you enjoyed learning about K-19 and her crew, and how their actions helped avoid nuclear disaster and war. Let us know in the comments below what part you found the most interesting. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. See you next time. Bye.